brother. Duncan ran as fast as his little legs could carry him. It wasn't very fast, but he had an advantage that most small children had. He was agile. His chest hurt too much from the running and panting for him to scream any more. There was no way he'd be able to outrun his pursuer. He tripped on a root and down he went. He rolled onto his back and raised a hand with a whine in a vain attempt to protect himself from the oncoming dog. It snarled as it came close. He could feel the hot breath now. When the beast was about to bite, a large stick hit it, causing the dog to yelp. Duncan spun his head around, and rushing over him was an older and stronger boy. He flew over to the dog, stick still in his hands, and placed himself between the dog and Duncan protectively. He took another swing at the dog's face when it tried to come at him. "Get out of here," he shouted. "Get out of here before I kill you!" He waved the stick threateningly and made himself appear as aggressive as possible. It was a big dog, and certainly had the means to attack even this larger boy, but it began to wonder if it was worth it. It backed away as the stick was swung like a bat or axe. This was too much of a hassle. The dog slowly moved away and eventually ran back off into the woods. "Abel!" Duncan finally shouted. The older boy turned around and hurried to his knees by Duncan's side, holding the boy close. "Duncan, I told you to stay put," he scolded, though he was still so relieved that the boy seemed all right. "Did it get you? Are you bleeding?" It didn't seem so, and Duncan shook his head to confirm it. It had never landed a bite. Abel brushed the dirt from Duncan's coat, hat, and scarf. "Why didn't you listen?" "You took so long," he replied, "and then I saw a doggy and wanted to pet him. It was a bad doggy. I dropped Dinker." Abel sighed, a little in relief, a little in frustration. "Duncan, you have to listen from now on. I almost didn't get here in time. I don't want anything to happen to you. Do you understand?" Duncan pouted with those big puppy eyes and nodded, almost on the brink of tears. Then again, little kids were good at this expression. Abel wasn't as easily swayed as the adults, but he was in the role of caretaker, even though he hadn't even hit puberty yet. "I lost Dinker," Duncan repeated. Dinker was a plush dinosaur that he took with him everywhere. This put Abel in a bit of a situation. Dinker would likely be back towards the clubhouse. He almost weighed in how much it was worth to even venture back to it. It would take time out of the day, and they needed to keep going. They couldn't dally for too long. He looked back into that face. It was getting hard to look at him. Finally, he let out a sigh as he reached out and took the little mittened hand. "Okay, let's go back and see if we can find him." Duncan hopped along happily, but Abel didn't pay too much attention to him. Instead, he kept his vigil. He was still worried that the dog could return. It made him angry. There was always a chance to see wild animals of some sort, but too common without an owner nearby. Abel didn't hear or see any sign of an owner to that beast, though. It didn't matter, though. As desperate as the boys were, Abel would not have allowed Duncan to go with a man who had such a vicious dog. The woods were a much safer alternative. "There he is!" Duncan shouted, pointing to the bright green and yellow clump on the side of the path. Abel let go of his hand and allowed the child to run over and retrieve his toy. He hugged it close before waddling back. "Dinker says he was scared, but he's happy now. Thank you for helping me find him." Abel couldn't help but smile. "It's nothing. We have to hurry, though. We can't waste any more time." He turned back and offered his hand. Duncan held Dinker firmly against himself with one hand and took hold of Abel with the other. He looked up at the older boy with a smile, partially hidden under his scarf. It had really been a rough couple of days for the boys. It was much harder on Abel than it was for Duncan, though. The smaller boy didn't seem to realize the situation they were in or anything that had happened. It didn't seem to matter to him currently, and that was a good thing. This was a fun adventure for them in his mind, even if a bit strange. The long walk was rather uneventful. There were some birds and a few early risers, such as squirrels, though the cold of winter hadn't entirely subsided yet. The trickling and plopping of melting snow helped to take away from any sort of quiet. As if it wasn't wet enough, it felt like such a miserable day. Abel prayed so hard that it wouldn't rain. They only had so much protection, and rain would really make things a lot more difficult than they already were. Abel knew his way to the clubhouse, and he knew some good places nearby to play, but he had not been out in these woods without Dad nearby. He felt pretty vulnerable and had to hide it. All he could do was lead Duncan along the path as it continued into unknown parts of a hiking trail for him. He didn't know how long it was or where it would ultimately lead. He hoped that he'd find something promising. They wouldn't be able to last out here too many more days. "I'm hungry," Duncan suddenly said. It pulled Abel from his thoughts and vigilance as he looked down at him. "I know," was all he could reply. "I'll give you something to eat soon, okay?" "I have to tinkle," was the child's response. "Well, that could be handled." "Do you want me to hold Dinker for you?" he asked. Duncan gave a shake of his head and held Dinker up to him. "Don't wander too far, Duncan," he warned. "I won't," he replied, as he went off towards a bush. He took off his mittens and shoved them in his pocket. Meanwhile, Abel stood nearby and examined the dinosaur. It was a green brontosaurus with a yellow underbelly. It was a little dirty, but overall the condition wasn't too bad. No signs of the trauma that had occurred was evident on the fabric. Duncan returned, fighting to get his mittens back on before holding his arms out for Dinker to be returned to him. Abel took his hand again, and again they continued along the narrow path. He pointed out a few random things along the way when he felt Duncan was growing a bit too bored. This wasn't exactly a scavenger hunt. It was Duncan's keen eyes, however, that pointed to an anomaly on the path. "Abel, look! It's a yard!" Abel whisked his head to look where Duncan was pointing. There was a rusty fence and a gate. It did look like it led into a yard of some sort. There was a small path that led towards it, so there had to have been traffic to and from this place. He led the boy closer so as to inspect it. The gate creaked loudly as it opened. The grass was tall and a yellowish color, as if this part of the yard had not been maintained in a long time. It stood even taller than little Duncan. Abel was a little taller than the grass, but just barely. He held firmly onto Duncan's hand, afraid that he'd lose him in that wispy jungle. He was the first to see beyond the grass, into the more manicured landscape, and the haunting truth of the matter. It wasn't a private yard, but a large old cemetery. Abel had mixed feelings about that, and he almost wondered if it was better to keep Duncan in the grass, or lead him back into the woods on the other side of the fence. The day was growing short, and the sky was already getting dark. Sunset was coming, and the overcast was heavy. It was a tough call. He let out a sigh and ducked back into the grass, grabbing onto Duncan's shoulders. "I need you to be a big, brave boy for me, Duncan, okay?" he requested. Duncan was understandably confused and a little startled. He looked Abel in the face in an attempt to figure out why he was suddenly so worried. "Abel, are there monsters?" "No," he assured. "There are no monsters, but it's a little creepy out there. I want you to take a deep breath and be really brave for me." "I'll try," he whimpered. "Good," Abel sighed. "That's good." And with that, he allowed Duncan to come out of the grass and look at the large hilly cemetery. He held Dinker tightly and then held firmly onto Abel. "Abel, it's a graveyard," he observed nervously. "Are we where the ghosts are?" It'll be okay, Abel assured again. Think of it as just a really big yard with a lot of stones. There's nothing to worry about. Duncan was both frightened and intrigued. He had seen cemeteries on television and passed them on car rides, but he had never actually been in one before. He followed Abel to one of the flatter stones and sat down on it. Abel didn't bother worrying about how respectful it was to the dead person. He was more concerned about letting the child rest without getting too wet. He reached into the backpack he had been carrying and pulled out a granola bar. There weren't many things in the backpack, but there was enough that he had pulled out of the clubhouse early on. Duncan frowned at the granola bar. These hiking treats were all he had been eating, and he was well beyond tired of them on the first day, especially since he only got to eat one the whole day. He was getting a bit cranky, but he had already exhausted the fight on the first day. He took the granola bar and opened it to munch on it with a great sense of dissatisfaction. He then watched as Abel stood up and began to look around. Abel? Duncan held out half the granola bar. Aren't you going to eat some? I'm not hungry, he replied with a forced smile. You eat. I want to see if there's a church nearby. Duncan looked up to the sky and then flinched as a droplet hit him between the eyes. It's raining. Of course it is, Abel muttered under his breath. He returned to the child and took off his coat. He wrapped it about Duncan, allowing it to dangle a bit in the front. The child was shocked by this. No, no, he argued. Abel, no! It'll be okay, Abel insisted. You'll get cold and wet. Abel chuckled, dressed in a pair of sweatpants and a simple white t-shirt and a pair of dark green gloves. He mindlessly rubbed his bare arms, and a bit of steam did escape as he tried to laugh. Still, he denied the child's reasoning. It's fine, Duncan. I'm not cold at all. You stay warm and dry, and I'll find us a place to stay tonight. Duncan was slow to follow, watching Abel from a distance as he scrambled about. There did seem to be a church in the distance, and it made sense to try and get to it as quickly as possible before they got too wet, or it got too dark. It upset him to see Abel practically in just his pajamas. He felt a bit guilty. He was dressed far better than the older boy. He had warmer pajamas on under a second pair of pants. He was wrapped in a small fleece blanket about the torso and had a thick coat with a hood, but also a hat, mittens, and a scarf. Now he had the second heavy coat to use as an umbrella. He was actually a little hot, but Abel would not allow him to take off any of his clothes. His adventure wasn't much fun anymore. He wanted to go home and sleep in his own bed. He wanted a bath, and he wanted a real meal. He wanted to play with his toys, and he wanted to watch television. He began to whine at this point. He was tired of being outside. He did so quietly, though, still feeling a bit of guilt that Abel gave up his outside clothes for him. Abel was always generous, but this was a little different than normal. This wasn't letting him pick the movie they watched, or letting him pick the pretend scenario for the toys. This didn't feel like Abel was just being nice because he was the best big brother ever. This felt like it was more serious, and it bugged him that he couldn't understand. A sudden banging caught his attention, and he quickly raised his eyes to see they had made it to the back of the church. Abel had a rock in his hand, and he was banging against the lock. "What are you doing? You'll get in trouble." "Don't worry about it," Abel panted. He held his hand out to motion for Duncan to keep his distance. "Stay back there, okay? I don't want you to get hurt." "I don't want to get in trouble, Abel," he cried out. "You won't get in trouble," he insisted, as he banged a few more times, eventually breaking the lock off the door and having it squeak open. He tossed the rock aside and held out his arms. Duncan was still spooked by such a naughty thing, but ran to him on the brink of tears. "It's okay. You won't get in trouble. I promise, okay?" Abel's voice was soothing and reassuring. "This is all me. You've done nothing wrong." "I want to go home," Duncan whimpered. Abel didn't give a verbal response to that. He just stroked the child's head before leading him inside. He reached into the bag and gave him a flashlight and took one for himself. It was dark inside and quite dusty. "Be careful," Abel warned. "I'm going to look around and see if there's a phone." He gave Duncan a gentle push. It was a small church with rooms and a kitchen in the back. The rooms were probably offices and maybe a room for Sunday school. He examined the kitchen and found nothing of value. There was no fresh food, and none of the lights worked. He then moved into one of the offices. It looked as if it hadn't been used in quite some time. He moved slowly towards the desk. The calendar on top had the wrong year on it, which seemed to confirm that thought. There was also an old rotary phone. It seemed a silly thing to do, but Abel couldn't help but have the slightest bit of hope. He reached out and took hold of the phone and pulled it from its place and brought the receiver to his face. He listened carefully to the silence. There was nothing, and yet he couldn't seem to convince himself that there was just no dial tone. There was nothing. He could call no one. "Why?" he whispered so softly to himself that it couldn't even be considered a whisper. It was almost just a thought, mouthed with no force. They were stuck for another night, it seemed. A loud bang and chaotic sound filled the building and threw Abel into a panic. He dropped from the start and dropped both the phone and the flashlight. He scrambled about to retrieve it and hurried to the hall and into the front of the church. There, he grew a flicker of anger and frustration, but again, a sense of relief when he saw Duncan banging on the old, out-of-tune piano by the pulpit on the stage. "Duncan! Dear Lord, you scared the heck out of me!" Abel shouted, clutching his chest. Duncan stopped immediately and looked at him in surprise. "I'm sorry, Abel." He let out a sigh and patted the boy on the shoulder. "It's okay. Doesn't look like anyone's been here in a long time. There has to be a way to get to town nearby. We'll go tomorrow and see what we can find." "Abel, when can we see Mommy and Daddy again?" Abel kept his eyes on the floor. He chose to ignore it and sat himself on one of the pews. "Would you like me to read you a story?" he asked. "There are some books in the Sunday school classroom, and I still have your dinosaur book in my bag." "No," Duncan replied sternly. "Where are Mommy and Daddy? Can we go home?" "When can we go home?" Abel sighed and ran his hands through his damp hair a few times. Duncan turned around on the piano stool and watched him curiously. Abel wasn't really sure what to say or how much. He was just a little kid. He didn't need to know all the horrible details. He thought carefully in order to choose his words wisely. "You can't see Mom and Dad anymore," he said. "Why?" "They are gone." "Where did they go?" Duncan asked. "Maybe a policeman can find them." "Do you remember the goldfish you had last year?" Abel asked, trying to explain this in a way the child could understand. "Yeah." "Do you remember how it stopped swimming?" "You said it died," he replied. Ah, yes. Abel had been a little more direct back then. It was just a goldfish, after all, and something Duncan wouldn't be too attached to for too long. "You said it went to Goldfish Heaven to live with Goldfish Jesus." Abel had to sit there in silence for a few minutes. This got a little more awkward than he expected, and it was already pretty awkward as it was. Luckily, it seemed the silence had given Duncan the time he needed to start putting the pieces together. "Abel, are Mommy and Daddy died too?" he asked with a bit of worry. "Yeah," he whispered back. He watched as that little shattered face saddened, and he clutched Dinker so close. Abel had to look away. He just couldn't look at that little broken face. "Why?" he asked. "The smoke detector didn't go off." This left a very long and awkward silence between them. Duncan moved to the pew and scooted close to Abel with a sniffle. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," he said. "Don't let me die, Abel." "I won't let you die," he replied. "But I do need for you to be a strong and brave boy, okay? You need to listen to what I say until we get out of this." Duncan nuzzled against him before giving a sad nod. "You're cold, Abel. You can have your coat back." "You just sit tight. I'm going to look around some more," he explained. "Maybe I can find something better for you to sleep on than the ground or these hard pews. If you want, you can go into that room over there and read the books. Don't go anywhere else, though, okay?" "Okay," he agreed. He slid off the pew and made his way to the dark classroom and examined the dusty children's books with a flashlight. This gave Abel the opportunity to look around some more for anything. Duncan was certainly being a very brave boy. Perhaps Abel had underestimated him. He was obviously upset, but he seemed to have taken the news better than expected. He had thought that Duncan would become horribly ornery and uncooperative, spiraling out of control with a fit of tears. It wouldn't surprise him if he did start crying alone in that room. Even if he had been spared most of the details, the simple version was enough. It had been horrible, and Abel, unfortunately, had to see it. The smoke detectors were old, and Dad had not replaced the battery. In fact, he had removed it after an incident in the kitchen where Mom's cooking kept setting it off. Everything in the house seemed to need an upgrade. What exactly had caused the fire was uncertain. Perhaps it was faulty wiring. Whatever it was, it had started to devour one end of the house in flames. There was never a noise, never a peep. It had been terrifying to come face to face with that blaze. He had had to think so fast. He was the one to have to wake up the sleeping child and usher him outside. He had practically carried Duncan out, since he was just so stubborn about waking up. He got lucky, though, breaking a rule to never re-enter a burning house. The back room had the coats and shoes, and Abel had risked a lot to retrieve them. It wasn't the most sane choice, but the cold snap outside and the wet, melting snow under socks wouldn't have been much more beneficial, at least to him. He knew only one location, as this was a new location for them. He remembered the clubhouse they had visited at the end of August. He had told Duncan that this was an adventure, and it wasn't much of a lie, since it was dark and required a lot of guesswork and scrambling. The clubhouse proved to be a saving grace. There were supplies there, like the flashlights and batteries, a spare pair of pants, and lots of blankets. There was a box of granola bars and even Duncan's dinosaur book. There had been little resistance, and the idea of camping, even in cold weather, in the clubhouse seemed like fun to the ignorant child. That brought him to the current situation. It wasn't as much fun the following 2 days with limited supplies, and no idea where to go, and a less comfortable place to rest. They were bundled better, but it was still spooky, and Abel had gotten relatively little sleep. He had become far too invested in keeping a watch like a paranoid meerkat to prevent any harm befalling Duncan. He was the man of the family now, right? Who else would look after the child? He sure couldn't look after himself. Abel was certainly a selfless sort, but this was far more than he had ever expected he'd ever have to do for him. This was more than what a big brother was supposed to do normally. Still, it was not worth it to complain. It was inconvenient, but in the grand scheme of things, he didn't really mind. However, it was already apparent that Duncan was more observant than he had hoped. Abel couldn't even remember the last time that he had eaten. His stomach was a real trooper, daring not to growl at all. In truth, Abel didn't even feel hungry. He had felt the cold, but not the hunger. Perhaps, come daybreak, all of this could finally be put behind them, and they could move on. Duncan needed an adult. No matter how selfless Abel tried to be, he'd never be the adult that the child needed at that moment. There wasn't much in the church, but it kept them dry and warm overnight. The rain had been pretty hard. There was even thunder and lightning for a while. The carpeting on the floor was musty, but it was softer than the hard wooden pews. There were a few odds and ends in one of the rooms. Building a little fort had proven a nice distraction. Before long, Abel held the sleeping Duncan in his arms, the child holding tight to Dinker and sucking on his thumb. Abel spent the night feeling like a protective mama bear. In due time, the morning did come. Despite having gotten little sleep, Abel was the first one awake. He managed to open the front of the church and looked into the parking lot. There was indeed a road, and the rain had become a drizzle. A road meant cars. He wasn't entirely sure if this was a busy road or not, but it was still neatly paved, so there had to be some sort of traffic. The issue on Abel's mind then was, is it safe to hitchhike? On the one hand, it could get them to some help faster. On the other hand, it meant a total stranger could pick them up and take them anywhere. Was it worth the risk? He didn't care what happened to him, but he was far more careful about the sort of risk to which Duncan could be exposed. Either way, sitting in the abandoned church wouldn't do them much good for too much longer. Abel woke Duncan and bundled him up once again. Again, he gave the child his coat as an umbrella, and they then ventured along the road, choosing a direction and walking along the shoulder. Duncan watched Abel carefully, seeing the slight shivers. He even offered the coat back a few times, but Abel refused to take it. They walked only about 20 minutes before hearing a loud crash. Both spun around with a start. Nobody was coming, but that sound had definitely happened, hadn't it? "What was that?" Duncan cried. "I'm not sure," Abel replied. He grabbed onto the branch of a nearby tree and began to make the climb. He was always good at getting at very high places. To his shock, he saw the mess that had been the church not long ago. His heart sank. Any delay, and they could have still been inside. "Abel! Abel!" Duncan called up. "What is it?" "It's the church," he called down as he made his way back to the ground. He let out a grunt when he dropped to his feet and began to usher Duncan along some more. It was the church. It fell down. "The church fell down?" Duncan repeated. "Why?" "I don't think anyone has taken care of it for a long time," he explained. "We got really, really lucky. We got out just in time." "Are we died?" Duncan gasped. "No," Abel chuckled. "You're fine. You're still alive. We got out in time. I just said that. We have to keep going, though. Maybe we can find someone with a phone." "There aren't a lot of people out here, is there?" he huffed. "I like where we lived before." "I know," Abel said with a nod. "I did too. We wouldn't be in this situation if we were there. Even if something had happened, there are so many neighbors. Everything could have turned out differently. I don't like how spread out everything is here." Duncan gave Dinker a squeeze, and with his other hand reached up to wrap it around Abel's arm. He responded by removing his hand from the child's shoulder and gripped onto the little mittened hand. "I want pancakes," he suddenly said. "I want pancakes with butter and maple syrup." "That sounds really yummy," Abel agreed. "French toast is yummy, too." "Yes, it is. Anything is better than granola bars." Abel looked down at him and forced a smile. "I know you don't want to eat them. Hopefully you won't have to eat them any more after today." "I hope not. I want cooked food like Mommy makes. I want milk." "I hear you," he agreed. "All those things sound good. I just need you to keep going a little while longer." And on they continued. The road was so empty, and it continued and wound around forever. It was a great wet day for sitting inside and watching television or playing video games. It wasn't even such a bad day to go out with the rubber boots and raincoat to jump in puddles. However, that sort of thing was followed by a hot bath and hot cocoa. Duncan was a pretty typical little kid. He got dirty a lot and was very active both inside and outside. However, even he was feeling gross and clammy with all this dank weather. Even Dinker needed a wash. He smelled funny. They all smelled funny thanks to that musty and mildewed church. The clouds were heavily overcast again. It made it hard to really keep track of the sun. It felt like hours, and it could very well have been. Finally, though, it looked like a small community was coming into view. There were small homes on lots and a few small farms. "Abel, look! Houses!" Duncan cheered. "I see," he replied quietly. Animals were alive on the farms, and there were some regular-looking cars and trucks in some of the driveways. Finally, some sort of life had been found. It didn't even matter which house they chose at this point. Abel chose a random driveway and led Duncan along. The clouds even began to clear as they approached the house. Perhaps it was silly, but Abel felt a lot warmer and happier to see the sun shining through. It felt like a happy ending was finally coming to this horrible nightmare. They had made it. Abel released Duncan and leaned over to stretch and rest. The child was far more excited and rushed ahead of him, up the walkway and stairs. He leapt up to ring the doorbell and jumped excitedly in place as he called out, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" It took a few moments, and Duncan almost returned to Abel in defeat. But then the door made promising noises, and it opened. Out peered a middle-aged woman. She watched Duncan suspiciously and curiously. "Can I help you?" "Hi, I'm Duncan. I'm hungry. My mommy and daddy got died in my house. I'm 4. The woman was a bit confused by his outburst, but then stepped out and squatted down on the stoop to be at his level. "Where are you from?" "Over there," he said, pointing far off in the direction that he and Abel had come over the last few days. The woman stood and called in to her husband to call the police. Abel was relieved to hear that. He was surprised to hear that a search party had been out there. He didn't hear anyone coming or calling for them. How could everyone have missed them? It didn't matter. It didn't matter anymore. Finally, all of this could be put behind them. It would still be hard, he figured, but at least they had made it this far. He smiled as the woman took Duncan's hand. "Don't you worry, we'll fix you up. Let's get you something to eat." Duncan was ecstatic. "I want pancakes." "I can make pancakes," she smiled. "Dinker and Abel like pancakes too," he cheered. "Oh, do they?" she pandered. Duncan nodded enthusiastically and turned back. "Abel, she said she'd make us pancakes. Isn't that great? Now we don't have to eat granola bars anymore." "That's wonderful," Abel called back. "See, I told you you wouldn't have to eat them for much longer." "Do you have milk?" Duncan asked hopefully. The woman looked back and forth between them and smiled a bit nervously. Yes, I have milk." "She has milk!" Duncan cheered. "Come on, Abel, let's have pancakes and milk." "It sounds delicious," Abel replied as he began to take a few steps closer. The woman knelt down again to be at Duncan's level and put a hand on his back. "How did you get here anyway? An angel must really be looking over you for you to make it all this way here." "I followed my big brother. He got me out of the house before I got died. Then he took me and Dinker for a long adventure. We got to a church and it fall down. We walked a long time and now we're here." He looked towards the older boy and bounced a bit. "Tell her, Abel. You're better at telling stories than me." Maybe you should wait and have some food, Abel suggested. It can all wait. Let's get the pancakes and milk. Doesn't that sound better than standing out here and talking? Yeah, the child agreed. The woman looked back and forth between them again, before looking a bit concerned. She stood up and looked at her husband, who was now standing in the doorway. He shrugged and moved aside so that Duncan could rush inside. Pancakes! 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 The woman's husband shrugged and chuckled. She came close, wanting to keep quiet. Kids, he said simply. They're like that. It's creepy, she whispered to him. She gave a little shiver to emphasize that statement. It's not creepy, he insisted. But Sean, there was nobody else there. Okay, so Brother was kind of a weird story. It was kind of sort of started with free writing, and the only thing I really had planned was that I wanted to use the name Abel, and that was about it. And I kind of had to make it up as I went. Like I said, I didn't have any plan. And it's a kind of a story where it's up to the reader to interpret what a lot of it means. So I really can't explain all the little details because, there are different ways that each person could interpret it. Maybe Abel is an angel. Maybe, maybe he's just a ghost. Maybe he's the imaginary friend. You don't know. And it doesn't really, even though we see it more from Abel's point of view, it really doesn't solidly claim who and what he is aside from Duncan's brother. And all we know is that he is, quote unquote, not really there in the end. So it's really, like I said, it's really up to the reader as to how this could be interpreted and what you think Abel actually is, or who he is, and when all this occurs. But that's pretty much it. I mean, there's really not much more to it. It was a pretty simple story. And like I said, the only reason I even started writing it was because I wanted to use the name Abel. And it had occurred to me at some point that both boys would be ghosts. They'd both be dead. And they were trying to get into heaven or something. But then I thought, maybe that's too much. I mean, it's still an interesting concept, but it just didn't feel right at the time. And I thought it would be more interesting to have one of the boys still alive or exist. And that's kind of what I did. So, well, that's not kind of what I did. It's what I did.